Hello, everyone. My name is Tracy Siska. I'm Executive Director of the Chicago Justice Project and also host of our Facebook Live interview series. We're honored today to have Charles Green and Gerald Casaglad with us. Today, we're going to discuss Charles's case a little bit. I had him unfortunately spent 24 years as a guest of the Illinois Department of Corrections, starting when he was 16, and also we're going to talk about what is now should be a famous FOIA request to a lot of Chicagoans, where the battle is about opening basically decades of police misconduct files. So, Jared and Charles, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, I'm going to start with you, Jared. Can you give us a little bit of the circumstances around Charles' 1984 conviction?
Sure. So there was a quadruple murder known as the Hamlin murders in the city of Chicago. And about a month after the crime had taken place, the police had no suspects or leads on who had done this. And they started to manufacture evidence to help them convict some people of this crime. And to help them do that, they went and arrested Charles Green from his home, and they took him to the police station where he spent 27 hours, and he ultimately made a statement that he had received $25 in exchange for knocking on the door of this house that two other people broke into and murdered these four people. And they needed Charles to be a witness against these two people to convict them. And instead of being a witness, they ended up convicting Charles of murder for making that statement.
Do we know why? Do we have any inclination why it was Charles? I mean, why they picked him up specifically? Was it just any average black man, or was this just something that was he known to them for some reason?
Well, according to the police officers in the case, they had talked to a series of witnesses who had led them to Charles. But the reality is all of those witnesses denied making statements to the police. And one of them claims that he was beaten up and forced to make a statement to the police about Charles Green. So, we don't know exactly why they chose Charles, but I could hazard a guess that they took advantage of a 16-year-old kid who was impressionable and was a cooperative person willing to make a statement in order to get himself home.
Okay, so tell us about, there's a somewhat famous detective that was involved in this case. So Detective Somerville at some point goes from detective and police officer to defendant and convicted felon. Tell us about Somerville's role and also how he ended up in prison himself.
So Detective Somerville was the lead detective in the case, and there's numerous opinions in the appeals court written about allegations of his coercive confessions, which were taking place in Area 4 at the time, along with now a famous Detective Cato. And he, in 1990, was caught using his police badge to lure women into a vehicle where he sexually assaulted them. And he was identified by some of the victims and had a somewhat famous standoff with the police inside his home. And then he was ultimately convicted of felonies and, is now a felon, and he was discharged from the police department.
And what was his role? Was he the lead detective in Charles' case? Was he part of the interrogation?
He was part of the interrogation, part of the people who used coercive physical tactics against Charles and other people in the case to get them to make statements. And, he was an important part of why Charles got convicted. He also, incidentally, should have been an important part of why Charles was not convicted at trial. But things did not go that way due to numerous injustices that happened in Charles's case.
So was there any evidence that there was well, first of all, was there a connection between the people that they believe did the shooting in this case and Charles? Or, I mean, because a lot of you find out when you look at these wrongful conviction cases that there sometimes the defendants have actually no relationship whatsoever. Was there any kind of relationship between the people that they think did this shooting and Charles?
Loosely, I mean, this is the 1980s, and you're talking about a neighborhood, where people
Mhm.
are together. So, but there was no actual criminal connection. Charles had never been convicted of a crime. He was 16 years old. He had never been involved in a murder or a burglary or anything like that. And they just needed someone because they needed a witness to identify the two people who they thought did it. They incidentally got the wrong people. The two people they said
Okay,
did it weren't
so
the ones who did it.
so the ones that the ones they convicted for the shooting actually didn't actually do the shooting. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, probably not. I mean, we don't know for sure, but the thing is as the case unfolded, there was a lot of evidence that two other people actually did the shooting and burned the building down. There was a fingerprint found on the gas can that was used to start the fire that came back to a known violent drug enforcer uh, and named Bodine. And there was a statement by one of the murder victims given after the crime. She survived for a month after the crime happened. And the prosecution in Charles's case fought hard to keep the victim's own statement about what had happened and who did this to her out of evidence in Charles's trial. And the trial obliged that request and excluded the victim's own statement about what had happened from Charles's trial so that it wouldn't conflict with the people they were trying to convict of the crime.
Okay, so just so we're clear, and I think it's vitally important on these cases to be crystal clear, was that that statement? I'm going to say alleged statement, but that's that statement. Was that statement given to police, or is this just something they said to some medic, supposedly, like a
No,
paramedic or the
the,
doctors?
the police went to her hospital room after the crime had happened. She had suffered severe burns and smoke inhalation from the fire, and she escaped her. She was tied up before the fire started, and left for dead. And she escaped her ties into the snow, and she went into the hospital. They took her to the hospital, and the police visited her in the hospital. And the police took a statement from her about who did this and what had happened. And she gave a very detailed account that the prosecution felt was not reliable and argued to have it excluded as hearsay from his trial after the victim died, which is an insane point of view because it was the murder victim's own words about what had happened to her. She wasn't lying. There was no reason to think she was. It just conflicted with their theory of Charles getting paid $25 to knock on the door. And so they didn't want to include it in the trial.
Well, when you hear it like in the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s and 90s, this cooperation between the police and prosecutors, right? Here's a prime example. They buried this statement that the police took themselves from the victim. I mean, it boggles to mind. I mean, so do we know who the prosecutor was on the original case?
I don't recall the person's name who was
Okay.
at the trial. There were a few prosecutors who worked on the case. But I can tell you that it wasn't buried. I mean, it was known that the victim made this statement. They excluded it from the evidence, which is an insane point of view because who are they fighting for if it's not for the murder victims? They charged two people with murder. Who are they fighting for if it's not the murder victims? And why would the murder victims lie about who had done this to them? They couldn't explain that. They don't have any rationale. It just was not convenient because it conflicted with the idea that Charles Green was someone who was present at the scene and paid $25 to get the door opened. So they didn't want it part of the trial. It was an insane point of view. It was so insane, the Illinois Supreme Court said so in a written opinion and said in the co-defendant's case, Charles's co-defendant, Derek House, that his conviction had to be reversed because the victim's statement is reliable and needs to be admitted. And you can't have a fair trial if the victim who was murdered can't say in the courtroom what happened to her and who did this to her.
Wow.
That's
that. When you think of the 70s, 80s, and 90s around the Burge and everything, you think of this grand conspiracy, and right, and like, oh my God, people are like, oh my God, the cops and prosecutors, they would never en masse conspire. I always called it a conspiracy of like-mindedness, which is they knew exactly what they needed to do. They didn't have to talk about it and come up with a grand conspiracy. They know what they needed to do to get the result they wanted. I would like those prosecutors' names because that action in and of itself should be tagged to them for the rest of their lives, right? That they're still around.
And it should be. And you know, and that was sort of the irony of the process of fighting for Charles. Is one of the things we did was we went to the Cook County State's Attorney Kim Fox and her wrongful conviction unit that she had formed, and they found Charles's case compelling. But there were two things that happened in my discussions with them that were concerning. One is that they refused to interview Detective Somerville on the grounds that they thought that he would plead the Fifth Amendment, which of course is somewhat shocking in and of itself.
Well, that's evidence. That's evidence, right?
Correct.
He pleads the Fifth and he refuses to talk about it. That's a reason.
They refused to gather it. And the second thing is that they talked to the prosecutor in Charles's case who said that there was nothing to be worried about. And they accepted his word about it. And that's, of course, just a totally insane thing to do. There's an appellate court judge named Eugene Pincham, who's a somewhat famous Supreme Court justice from Illinois. And he wasn't a Supreme Court justice at the time. He was on Charles's appellate court. And he wrote on his own a 70-page dissent, something like that, from Charles's conviction, explaining point by point in great factual detail how wrong it was that this 16-year-old kid was getting a sentence of life without parole for a murder that there were a lot of questions about. There was no other evidence aside from Charles's statement that he had done this crime. And he wrote that long dissent, which is unprecedented in Illinois jurisprudence, for a reason. And it was a historical record of the wrongdoing that had befallen Charles. And I think that he wrote it because he had it in mind that it would be taken to the Supreme Court. But Charles never appealed to the Supreme Court because Charles's lawyer gave up. Charles's lawyer had never done a murder case before and never did one again, thankfully. And after the appeals court wrote a lengthy opinion about why Charles was wrongfully convicted, and the efforts of the lawyers were extremely, not sufficient to represent Charles in this case, he gave up. He petitioned. He asked them to appoint a public defender. The Supreme Court refused because Charles's mother had paid a lawyer from her bank. And so they said that he probably had the resources to have a lawyer represent him on appeal. And they gave up. And so no appeal was filed to the Illinois Supreme Court, who ultimately reversed this entire trial. And so Charles's conviction would have been reversed but for the filing of a single piece of paper.
It's mind-blowing. Okay, one last question. Let's clear this up for people. So Charles was on a life sentence. Why is he free?
And so after, I think it was 5 efforts of Charles to represent himself pro se without a lawyer to continue to fight his conviction over the course of the years, eventually Derek House was released from prison. And
Derek House was the shooter, the convicted shooter.
Right. One of the shooters was never charged because they never had any evidence against him outside of Charles's statement. And Charles refused to testify because Charles didn't see anything. So they had no evidence against him. So he was never charged. The other guy who was charged as a co-defendant was Derek House, who also claimed that he was beaten up right away as soon as it happened, that he was beaten up and forced to give a statement about what happened. He was ultimately released from prison, and Charles was still in. So the guy who had actually done this horrible quadruple murder, supposedly, had been released while Charles was not. And so the public defender picked up Charles's case. And one of the things that happened that was so telling is that they went to Charles after the public defender picked up the case, and they offered to dismiss 3 of the murder charges against him if he would plead guilty to one of the murder charges, and they would allow him to go home right away. And he said no.
Wait. Why would the state's attorney do that? Why would you make a deal? In whose justice interest is that deal other than covering politically for the state's attorney's office and the cops?
It is a shocking
What justice is that?
It is a shocking abdication of prosecutorial responsibility, because it is a clear indication of what every legal professional who has reviewed this case knows, that Charles Green is not guilty. He's innocent of this crime. There is literally no credible evidence against Charles. The only evidence was a statement of a 16-year-old kid taken with no lawyer and no parent, who said in front of a grand jury, I'm testifying because I just want to go home. Because they had said, if you make this statement, you will get to go home. And instead, they charged him with murder because they wanted to use the charges to compel him to testify. They held the charges over his head, and they said, if you testify, they offered to him in the trial court, his attorneys, it was amazing. They said, the prosecutors went to him and said, if you testify, we will dismiss your charges. Literally, you will walk away from this murder case if you testify. And Charles said, no, I didn't see anything. I don't know what happened. I wasn't there. I'm innocent of everything, and I'm not going to testify and say a bunch of stuff that isn't true. There was a belief that the justice system would actually work and that he would be found not guilty. He was convicted by a judge who made a terrible decision.
Yeah, see, this is something that was, some of these issues were brought up in George Ryan's death penalty commission, right? I mean, you want to talk about justice reforms. You can't convict anyone just based on their statement. If you don't have corroborating evidence, they can't even go to trial. It's mind-boggling that you can convict someone with no evidence, and it's based is on their statement.
Especially when you have a detective who's going through the department and literally coercing confessions with physical force from witnesses and suspects on a regular basis. And the simple fact is that both the police and the prosecutors are indifferent to the fact that this was widespread throughout the police department in the 70s and 80s. And you have the current mayor of Chicago, writing a report on, the need for police reform and the use of these kinds of tactics by police officers far and wide in the 80s. And yet a city that is in just abject denial that any police misconduct occurs. They just defended a case involving Burge's henchmen in federal court and lost millions of taxpayer dollars for doing it because they simply will not stand up and do the right thing and say, we have a serious problem we need to look at from the 70s and 80s. Charles is lucky because he's out. There are people languishing in prison who were wrongfully convicted by these same tactics under similar circumstances, who don't have lawyers, who can't get their voices heard. And it's because Mayor Lightfoot is simply turning a blind eye. And it's just a continually shocking abdication of their responsibilities. It's like their plan is just to wait for everyone to die and then pretend like nothing ever happened. Yeah. And it was just all John Birch. I mean, that's just a lie.
So Charles' co-defendant gets his case reversed. The public defender picks up Charles' case, and then do they appeal? Is that how he ends up he becomes free?
So they do. They try to, they file something again in front of the trial court. Now, the judge who tried Charles's case in 2009 is long, I think he passed away. He was dead a long time by the time this happens. So it's assigned to a new judge, Judge Marjorie Laws. And they ask Judge Laws to find him innocent or in the alternative to let him go in the interests of justice. And Judge Laws did not have all of the evidence then at that moment in 2009. She didn't know what we've since found out, which is that Charles's then trial attorney, who saw Charles right after he was released from the grand jury, who saw bruising on Charles's face and knew that he had been beaten up by the police while he was in custody. And the lawyer never considered himself a witness or testified or otherwise gave a statement about that. But we've since gotten that evidence. And if Judge Loss had that evidence, she might have changed her mind. But the fact is she found that in the interest of justice, you can't hold a kid who took $25 to knock on a door for life without parole while simultaneously dismissing 3 murder charges against the actual guy who did this and cutting him a deal so he only had to serve a few years in prison. I mean, he served a long time in prison, don't get me wrong, but he'd also served the better part of a decade on death row where he was supposed to be executed until his conviction was reversed. So it changes your perspective when you've done that. There's a series of injustices that happened here at every level, from the fact that the police went into Charles's home and let a 16-year-old kid handcuffed with no parent and no lawyer into a trap where they forced him to stay at a police station for 27 hours, made a statement, testified in front of the grand jury, had no idea that he was going to be charged or convicted of murder because he said he knocked on a door. You know, why no one would know that unless you were a lawyer. And then they charged him to try to make him into a witness. They failed, and they just followed through on their effort to convict him, which the judge went along with, the appeals court went along with, and then the lawyers dropped the ball and didn't go to the Supreme Court where he was certain to be reversed. It's an insane case.
One of the George Ryan's Death Penalty Commission, one of the recommendations that was never acted upon is there was going to be a statewide panel of prosecutors that would have to authorize the seeking of the death penalty, because they cited in that report that prosecutors far too often use that to get a plea bargain, and people don't take it, the plea bargain, and then they end up going through in trial and convicting these people and getting the death penalty for things that should ordinarily get the death penalty. But because it doesn't coerce them, people end up getting the death penalty who ordinarily would not receive it. So, I mean, this is a little less severe, but still the same thing. So that new judge lets Charles out in the interest of justice.
Correct.
Basically. And
He spent an extra year in prison because he refused to plead guilty. And the prosecutors wouldn't on their own say, you get to go home and go free. The prosecutors, the state's attorney's office, they know that Charles is innocent. They've reviewed this case. They've looked at it. We met with the city attorney. You can read this dissent by Justice Pincham, and you know in 5 seconds that Charles is not guilty of this crime. And the city is
for our audience, when we embed this video in a post soon later on today, Judge Pincham's decision will be embedded in there, so you can go get it and read it for yourself. Okay, so let's switch over to this famous FOIA request. So,
sure.
Charles and you file a FOIA request in 2015 seeking access to police misconduct records, investigations, right, from basically our Office of Professional Standards, Internal Affairs. What were you hoping was in there, and why was this filed?
Well, so before we filed this request, there had been an administrative law judge who issued an order that in favor of the Fraternal Order of Police, the police union, that had required the city of Chicago to destroy the police misconduct files that we had asked for, which go back, I guess, to 1967. And what these files represent is a 50-year record of the police department's code of silence in protecting police officers from misconduct. And that's the reason the Fraternal Order of Police wants this record destroyed, because it shows a widespread effort to wrongfully convict, hurt, and otherwise abuse suspects throughout the 70s, 80s, and who knows, beyond or before. And so they're trying to destroy this record in order to prevent the public from learning the severity and longevity of their abuse of the citizens. And so I attended a conference that was being led by Jamie Calvin and Craig Futterman from the University of Chicago. And they were talking about their own efforts to get data. And I had been representing Charles since 2011. And at that time, Charles, there just wasn't a lot you could do. The for him because he'd been convicted and released from prison. And I came up with this idea, talking to Charles, that maybe there is something in there. Detective Somerville's a dirty detective. Have they been hiding this record, this conspiracy for all these years from him? And is that an avenue for him to be able to attack his conviction? And I talked to them about it, and I asked, why has no one ever asked for all of these files? And Mr. Futterman said, I don't know. No one has. So I think I went home that night or the next day, and I wrote a FOIA request for Charles and talked to him about it, and we submitted it and filed it and asked for all of these records, anticipating that we were going to be fighting with the city over whether or not we could get them. It was a lot of records. We knew that. They did not respond to our request at all. And that had some very significant... Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, that seems people don't understand. Well, with the new FOIA law that was put in 2010 for public bodies, the law basically says for public bodies to claim an exemption of overly burdensome, like it's just too much work, they have to respond to your initial FOIA request within 5 working days to be able to use that. So that's what the law says. So tell us what happened.
Yeah, so they didn't respond, and at the time they weren't responding to requests as a matter of routine, and they were basically gambling, right? And they were playing dice with the taxpayer money again, knowing full well that they could get hit with a multi-million-dollar problem where they have to produce a lot of records in short order because they just didn't respond within the time the legislature allowed them to. And we filed a lawsuit, in part because we wanted to get the records, and in part because we were afraid the records were going to be destroyed as part of a process, and that the administrative law judge had put in motion. Now, that effort ended up being unsuccessful several years later, as we just learned this year. But all the same, we didn't know that at the time. So we wanted them preserved, and we wanted to make sure that people like Charles and other people wrongfully convicted who might still be in prison had access to what we know is a extremely lengthy record of the police department's code of silence.
So in Charles' case, you're looking for, in the FOIA, part of this is you're looking to get the investigative history, if what there is of that, of Somerville, and to see how that may or may not impact Charles' convictions.
Well, no, in part. But what we're also looking at, more broadly, is the fact that when you examine the record of misconduct that the police department has, you get to learn about the web and levels of misconduct inside the department, because you get to see how the officers who engaged in misconduct interacted. For example, there's known officers who were abusive in the 1980s. It's just undisputed by everyone except maybe the Fraternal Order of Police that these officers tortured people and coerced wrongful confessions. And as you go back and you tie these different officers together and you examine their techniques and their tactics, no one had access to that kind of information or the data at the time that this was going on. It was everyone was in the dark about it. So in the 1980s, you didn't know that the detective had been accused of the same thing 8 other times, like Detective Somerville had been. And so you couldn't use that information in court or otherwise, but the city had it. The police department had that information. And so you get to tie back these officers and the techniques that they're used to their people who came before them and the people who served along with them. And you get to paint this picture of there's just no chance that police and prosecutors didn't, on a widespread basis, know what was going on in the area detective divisions during the 70s and 80s.
Right, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I agree that to some degree or another, this has to fall, whatever impact there is from opening these records, all of these records, and doing this analysis, it's got to target lawyers. It's got to target the prosecutors, because there is no doubt they either turned a willful blind eye or they were willing participants in this. I got a text a few years back when SOS, or I'm sorry, Mobile Strike Force, the replacement for this SOS unit, was active, from someone who was court watching one day, a researcher, and they're like, why is the Mobile Strike Force, they've had like 70 people come up through court today, and they're all on minor drug charges. Why do we have a special unit busting people for dime bags? I don't understand. And I have always thought, and part of CJP's transparency work is to get that baseline data from the everyday activities of the department, not just the misconduct data, but data on what they do every single day as part of their everyday duties, and trying to learn from those, because I am sure within there are patterns of abuse and misconduct and participation throughout the entire department. The Van Dyke case is a great example of that. Okay.
Well, and you're raising a really good point, because when you talk about the prosecutors being involved in this, one of the things that I think a lot of people don't understand about why is this all coming out now, right? Why now? Why is it the 2000s, the 10s, and we're just learning, we're just finding out about it? It's because the city's policies related to police misconduct, in large part, were written, designed, and governed by Mayor Daley, who, of course, famously was the state's attorney during the Burge era, and he directed these policies to cover up and to keep everything secret, and he made people fall in line and otherwise continue to cover up for what is just, when you look back at this record, will be seen as obvious abuse. And it's time for elected officials, both the alderman and the mayor of the city, to stop sticking their head in the sand about what we know, which is that men like Charles Green were wrongfully convicted, and the financial consequences on the city are going to be serious. But you can't continue to let people sit in prison when you know that detectives used bad techniques, and they know, and they're responsible.
Right. And see, my view has always been, when you start getting misconduct cases, the system should be forced, and I'm trying to force open the data to do it as an NGO, should be forced to still go take a look through the records of all that detectives' cases. Not like, oh, you push someone. I'm not talking about that kind of minor stuff, but I'm talking about they get accused by a judge. I think judges should be required. Anytime they don't believe a cop's testimony, that should be reported to an integrity unit, basically run out of, I believe, the U.S. Attorney's Office, where they go and look at, wow, this judge thinks this cop perjured himself. Let's go look if he did. And if they did, and they can prove it, then they have an obligation to go back and look at their other testimony. But the problem is the justice system is about convictions. It has nothing to do with justice. And it's so bad in this state that another part of Governor Ryan's commission is, it wasn't until around 2000, I think, is when this happened, that the Illinois Supreme Court literally changed their rules and forced it in that prosecutors have an obligation to justice, not just convictions, which is mind-boggling that it would take them to 2000 to codify that, right? Anyways, I just think there's a lot more accountability stuff that we should be doing, even when just the slightest bit of these cases makes it public. But I agree with you that everyone sticks their head in the sand. So your FOIA case, you get this, they fail to respond, you sue. It takes 5 years. Explain why it took so long, or why it's still going on, but why it took so long from the time you filed.
It took so long because of the city law department's tactics in the case. I mean, they came in and they started with the premise that there was a case ongoing between the FOP and the city that was going to govern the result of Charles Green's case. And that result came in June of 2016. And at that time, the city attorneys agreed that the case was effectively over with some minor issues left over, and they were going to begin gathering and producing responsive records. And 18 months after that, they decided they didn't want to do that anymore. And they changed course, and they tried to claim that they were entitled to win the case. And in April of 2019, Judge Flynn said, no, you are not. and you lose. And then Judge Flynn retired, and the city lawyers came in and tried to argue that Judge Flynn hadn't decided the case, which failed. And in January of 2020, Judge Conlin issued a extremely critical ruling talking about how the city willfully and intentionally violated the Freedom of Information Act in Charles's case, and to fine them thousands of dollars, $4,000 for doing so, and ordered the city to produce all of the records within a year.
Okay, so to stop, I guess the city or the city council, however we want to distinguish between those two, the city came to Charles, I believe, after this order and has made some financial, I guess, attempts at coming to some financial payoff, financial response in lieu of having to produce those records. Can you tell us about those financial offers?
I don't want to get into too many specifics about the financial offers, but they came to us at first with the idea that, in our discussions with the city, I had made it very clear that Charles's interest is in proving his innocence. And I asked them to review his case. And there was some effort to do that by the city attorneys who admitted the case is compelling. And it's because it's obvious. And but they said that they weren't in a position to talk about Charles's wrongful conviction. And so it was left alone. And then later, after they lost the case, they came to us and said, what about money? And we said no. And then they came back to us again and they offered $500,000, which is substantially more than they offer some of the people who get shot in the back by the police. And Charles is he's out of prison, but he's a convicted quadruple murderer who that's a lot of money to. And he's not in a position where he can turn that down. So I can let him speak to that, but there's basic needs at stake. And so they basically paid him $500,000 so that he can't get the records he needs to prove his innocence.
Right. So now we're at a situation, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong. So there's a signed agreement, I believe, in place somewhere with the city, but you're still fighting to try to get those records, right? Am I correct in that?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that I'm the only one. I mean, I think there's a there's an allied group of people who are fighting to get transparency from the police department. And literally, I think the police department lives or dies based on the release of these records, because once academics, researchers, and other people get hold of them, their tactics in handling citizens from the 70s and 80s and before and after come under a microscope, and it allows the public to see just how abusive the police really are, which I don't think people know. I don't think people know that the police do the kinds of things that they really do.
Right. And I think, we always say Chicago's had a lot of moments. Oh, we're in a moment now. Right. We said it after Laquan McDonald. We said it after the Burge thing. We said it after the Austin 10. Every big scandal, we're in a moment. And then nothing changes. Right. I mean, the Laquan McDonald case was the perfect. Right. It's the Laquan McDonald case was the perfect example. Right. This guy shoots this kid 16 times for no reason. The officers on the scene lie and cover up. The bosses come in, follow up, but lie and cover up. Right? It was the perfect example where things, if there was ever going to be a moment when things were going to change, in my opinion, that's it. And I think just recently, the Inspector General's office released a report on the response to subpoenas by the CPD. And they basically, in that report, they show how just totally broken the internal structures of the CPD are. Not even just on accountability, but just in general. Like they have no accounting for what they send to people who send them subpoenas, right? They have an obligation to do it. They don't know. And then, we talked to the Deputy Inspector General for Public Safety. She was a former prosecutor. She said in important cases, she would summon the detectives and tell them to bring the case file. And then that's how she would get materials turned over to her. But the defense doesn't have that capability. So they are stuck taking whatever they get. So I can only imagine what is going to be in those files. Do we know, and just real quick before we wrap up, do we know what is in Somerville's history? Do we have any real idea besides these convictions what his discipline history is?
He's never been disciplined at all. He as far as I know, I mean, he might have had some minor things, but he's got numerous allegations, and that's part of just what happened in the 80s and 70s. Because there's all these allegations, and I'll give you a good example. There's a case that was where a judge had numerous times rejected a defendant's plea that he was beaten, and it wasn't until Somerville was arrested that the judge reconsidered his request and reversed it, and excluded this confession as being as being coerced. And so, but no discipline because he'd already been fired. Because once that's kind of how they get you is that once they fire you, they say, "Oh, we don't care anymore. You're gone. We don't need to look at this anymore. It's all over." And they know it's not over. There's no moment here in the city. It's not happening now or at any other time. The conviction of Jason Van Dyke for the murder of Laquan McDonald was just an extension of making people feel like the system actually works. They threw Jason Van Dyke to the wolves. They know that he's just like every other police officer on the force. They've been shooting people in the back wrongfully and lying about it for decades. They've been wrongfully convicting people and torturing them for decades. And every once in a while, they take a police officer or two and they throw them in the criminal justice system and say, "See, look, everyone, the system works." Well, Rome is burning all around us because the city's literally on fire with police misconduct. Nothing has actually changed. Now you have cameras and you get to see shootings like George Floyd's. And it's shocking. And I have to tell people, the police have been telling the same story for decades and shooting people. And everyone said it was okay. It's working. This is how it's supposed to work. And it's really an atrocious abdication. There's no justice. It's about convictions. It's about putting people in prison and making people feel safe. And Charles is just a victim of what they've been doing since the beginning.
Right. And I try to tell people, they say the bad apples, it's all bad apples. And I said, the problem is the good cops know who the bad cops are. It's just that they don't do anything to stop the bad cops. The Van Dyke shooting was once again, the perfect example. One cop did something crazy. 10 cops on the scene could have just put cuffs on him right then and there, taken his gun, put cuffs on him, and done what they need to do. Instead, like 50 cops got involved in covering that up. Does that make all 50 the worst cops in the world? No, but they're not any good.
Including the Cook County Sheriff's Office.
Right. And so they're not any good. We can't rely on them to fix the department. They're incapable. And what I've been trying to tell our reform people in Chicago is we got to stop looking at the police accountability system as the solution. The back end doesn't work. And I've helped create the back end in Chicago. I've been involved since 1996 doing it. It's broken. It's not going to work. We have to put in front end. So it's got to be done in the front end. It means aldermen and the city council and the mayor have to get to work putting in front end regulations. You want to rule out chokeholds. You want to rule out putting kneeing on someone's neck. Make it a felony. Don't rely on the police accountability system. Don't rely on someone who's been victimized to get the strength to file the complaint and follow through. And also one other thing, I think all their pensions should be tied to cooperating with internal investigations for the rest of their time collecting a pension. So because like all of Van Dyke's, all the superiors in Van Dyke's case, except Eddie Johnson, most of them retired and got nice, cushy other jobs. The chief of police at the time, well, it was McCarthy, but the deputy chief, and then he went to chief. When the crap hit the fan, he went and worked, I think, at Northeastern. He's making like $200,000 as the chief of police from Northeastern Illinois University on top of his pension. There was a big fall for him, right? So,
John Birch kept his pension. The union literally voted to let him keep his pension after it was known that he tortured suspects. They don't care about misconduct.
Right. You can't rely on them. You can't. Right. You can't rely on them. It's got to be done. It's a democratic process. Supposedly, we live in a democracy. We got to put our elected leaders in who will do something. That's it.
Right. What elected leader needs to stand there and is going to tell me that you need to train police officers not to lie in court? That's just the stupidest thing. And you don't need to train anybody not to lie in court. You got officers lying in court because you've got really, really bad things happening inside your police department, and you don't want to know what they are. And every officer who's ever come forward and said there's a problem with lying has been told, shut up, keep your mouth quiet, do not say anything. And when you do say something, they get retaliated against. Most famously, you brought up the SOS, was Jerome Finnegan trying to hire a gang to kill people officers he thought were witnesses against him who were reporting his misconduct to the FBI. There's no accountability. You can't rely on them.
Right. There was an SOS officer murdered, by the way, during the unit's run. He died in the back of his apartment building late at night or very early in the morning that was surrounded by a 10-foot fence. And they said it was a random robbery. Someone was waiting outside. They didn't wait by the gate and rob him before he got behind the fence. They hopped the fence and waited for him there. Don't worry about it. Right. I also think judges and prosecutors should be mandated to report police perjury when they suspect it, and failure to do should have consequences on their law license. Right. That's other front end things that could be done. So, because basically there's been nothing that's ever happened to a prosecutor that I know of in all of these cases, in all the Burge cases, in all of these cases, even the wrongful convictions. I don't remember it ever affecting a prosecutor. You know, I have heard there's a Reader article about a prosecutor supporting perjury in a case from the police. The guy ends up being wrongfully convicted, getting out, or when he tries to get out, he appeals to the prosecutor because the prosecutor is now the judge, and the judge refuses to hear the appeal. He turns the appeal down, which I just thought is so quintessential Chicago and Cook County. Wait, where does this case go to? Oh, I was the prosecutor. Oh, he's saying I'm lying. Threw it out.
There's no question that police, prosecutors, and judges in Cook County have long had a very unhealthy relationship with each other, and they're not doing their jobs. None of them. Charles Green should never have been convicted. The judge in that case knew there was evidence that contradicted what Charles had said one time to the police when he was 16. There was evidence from the victim that contradicted it, and the judge knew it, and he excluded it and then found him guilty. It was a bench trial. The judge said, oh, no, you're guilty. You're proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt based on your statement. I'm going to forget about the fact that I know that there's this other evidence that I didn't allow in the trial that proves you're innocent. I mean, what is the role of that judge? What else has he done? I mean, no one was listening.
Right.
No one listened. And as a consequence, now the city has a nuclear bomb of a problem that they don't know how to solve. And all they can do is do what Mayor Lightfoot keeps doing, which is burying her head in the sand and pretending like none of this is real. It's all a big fantasy. I mean, you can't tell people enough that it's still going on to this day. Officers are lying about police shootings on a regular basis. Officers are lying about misconduct. There's systemic problems. You've got the Cook County sheriffs kidnapping people and holding them ransom so that they can give guns over. You've got crazy stuff still happening today in the police departments, and no one is accountable for it.
Well, right, and we don't have a media that looks at it either. So we have our crime reporters running around to cover every murder, but they're not covering what happens afterwards. So frustrating. All right, Jared, thank you so much. Our audience, this will be embedded on our website later today. It would also be on our YouTube channel, and also so thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And this will be up soon. I'll let you guys know when everything posts up online.
Thanks, Tracy.
All right. Thank you. Take it easy, guys.
Bye-bye.